The guitar stopped. Dylan's hands lifted. And 3,000 people held their breath. It was October 1978. The Warfield Theatre in San Francisco. Bob Dylan was midway through a song, one of the old ones, from the early years, the kind that audiences always wanted to hear. His fingers moved across the fretboard with practiced ease. His voice carried that familiar rasp, intimate and distant at the same time. The crowd was mesmerized. That particular stillness that only happens during a Dylan performance. Not the wild energy of rock concerts. Something quieter. More reverent. People leaning forward in their seats, trying to catch every word, every breath between the lines. And then, from somewhere stage left, near the wings where the crew stood in shadow, a voice. Barely audible. A whisper that somehow carried across the boards. A name. Just a name. Dylan stopped singing. His fingers froze on the strings. The note hung in the air for a moment, then died. His hands lifted away from the guitar entirely, left hand hovering above the fretboard, right hand pulled back, suspended in space. He turned his head toward the stage wing. Slowly. Like a man hearing something he thought he'd never hear again. The audience waited. Confused. Uncertain. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. The kind of silence that makes people shift in their seats, glance at each other, wonder if something has gone wrong. Dylan stood perfectly still, staring into the darkness of the wings. Dylan stopped mid-song, lowered his guitar, and turned to the stage wing. Someone had whispered a name no one had spoken in 40 years. The crew member who had whispered was named Marcus Webb. 63 years old. He'd been working as a stagehand at the Warfield for 15 years. Before that, he'd worked venues up and down the California coast. Quiet man. Did his job. Went home. Nobody knew much about him beyond that. What nobody knew, what Marcus had never told anyone, was that 40 years earlier, in 1938, he'd had a brother named William. William Webb was 17 years old when he died. Pneumonia. Quick and merciless. 1 week he was healthy, playing guitar on the front porch of their family's small house in Minnesota. The next week he was gone. Marcus was only 14 when it happened. Too young to understand how death could arrive so casually, so completely. He remembered the funeral. The small gathering. His mother's silent tears. The way his father had placed William's guitar in the casket, because William had loved that instrument more than anything. But what Marcus remembered most clearly was the song. William had been teaching himself to play. He wasn't particularly good, just a kid with a second-hand guitar and a dream of maybe playing at the church social someday. But he had one song he loved. An old folk melody their grandmother used to hum. William would sit on that porch and practice it over and over, never quite getting it right but never giving up. After William died, Marcus couldn't bear to hear that melody. For 40 years, he'd avoided it. Changed the radio station if it came on. Left rooms when someone started humming it. Carried the weight of his brother's absence like a stone in his chest. Tonight, standing in the wings of the Warfield Theatre, watching Bob Dylan perform, Marcus had been thinking about William. It happened sometimes. The memories surfacing without warning, especially when he heard live music. William would have loved this, he thought. Would have given anything to see Bob Dylan. And then Dylan had started playing that melody. The same one. The exact folk song William used to practice on their front porch in 1938. Marcus hadn't planned to say anything. He knew better than to interrupt a performance. But something had broken loose inside him. 40 years of silence shattering in an instant, and before he could stop himself, he'd whispered into the darkness of the stage wing. William. Just the name. Quiet. Almost inaudible. But Dylan had heard it. To understand what happened next, you need to understand something about Bob Dylan that few people knew. Dylan didn't talk about his family much. Didn't share personal history in interviews. Built walls around his private life with the same care he built bridges in his songs. But those who knew him, really knew him, the handful of old friends who'd been there from the beginning, knew about David. David Zimmerman, Dylan's younger brother. Born Robert Zimmerman in 1941, Dylan had grown up in Hibbing, Minnesota, with David as his constant companion. 5 years younger, David had looked up to his older brother with the kind of hero worship only younger siblings can manage. When Bobby picked up a guitar, David wanted one too. When Bobby started writing songs, David filled notebooks with terrible poetry. When Bobby changed his name to Bob Dylan and left for New York to chase a dream, David had stood on the porch of their parents' house and cried. They'd grown apart over the years. Not from conflict. Just from distance. Dylan's life had accelerated beyond anything either of them could have imagined. Tours. Albums. Fame. The machinery of success creating an ever-widening gap between who he'd been and who he'd become. David had died in 1968. Heart attack. 32 years old. Sudden and senseless. Dylan had been in the middle of recording an album when he got the call. He'd left the studio, driven to Minnesota, sat through the funeral in dark glasses and silence. He never spoke about it publicly. Never wrote a song explicitly about David. But those close to him noticed the shift. Something had changed in Dylan after that. A deepening. A withdrawal into himself that never fully reversed. And there was one song, that old folk melody their grandmother had taught them both, that Dylan had quietly stopped playing after David's funeral. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement. He just let it fade from his set lists. Turned down requests for it. Moved on. Until tonight. Tonight, for reasons Dylan couldn't have articulated if asked, he'd felt compelled to play it. First time in 10 years. He'd started the opening chords almost on impulse, not planning it, just following some instinct he didn't understand. And then, from the darkness of the stage wing, he'd heard a name whispered. William. Not David. William. But the same weight in that single word. The same quality of grief carried across decades. Dylan recognized it instantly because he'd carried the same weight himself. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. The audience was still waiting. Still silent. Still uncertain what they were witnessing. Dylan stood motionless for another moment, his gaze fixed on the shadows stage left. Then, slowly, he lifted the guitar strap over his head and set the instrument down against its stand. He turned to face the audience. I need to take a moment, he said. His voice quiet. Not apologetic. Just stating a fact. He walked to the edge of the stage. Not to the center, where performers usually addressed the crowd. To the far left, where the stage met the wing. He stood there, hands in his pockets, looking out at nothing in particular. Marcus Webb, still standing in the shadows, felt his heart hammering. He'd disrupted the show. He'd broken protocol. He'd let 40 years of grief escape in a single whispered word, and now Bob Dylan himself had stopped performing. But Dylan wasn't angry. He was just still. After what felt like an eternity, probably 30 seconds in real time, Dylan spoke again. Sometimes, he said, his voice carrying across the silent theater, you hear something that stops time. Just for a second. And you remember that the past isn't really past. It's just waiting. Right there behind everything. He paused. The audience barely breathed. I had a brother, Dylan continued, still not looking at anyone in particular, just speaking into the space. Died young. There was a song we both knew. Our grandmother taught it to us. I haven't played it in 10 years. Tonight I did. Don't know why. And somebody in the wings. He gestured vaguely toward the shadows. Somebody heard it, and remembered someone too. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. Marcus felt tears on his face. He didn't remember starting to cry. Dylan hadn't looked at him directly. Hadn't singled him out. But somehow, in that moment, Dylan had seen him anyway. Had understood. Dylan pulled his hands from his pockets. I think, he said, I'm going to play that song again. All the way through this time. For whoever needs to hear it. He walked back to his guitar. Lifted it. Settled the strap over his shoulder. His fingers found the strings. And he played. Slow. Deliberate. Every note given space to exist. The old folk melody their grandmother had taught him and David when they were boys. The same melody William Webb had practiced on a porch in Minnesota 40 years ago. Dylan sang it differently than before. Quieter. More intimate. Like he was singing it in someone's living room instead of a theater packed with 3,000 people. The audience listened in absolute silence. In the wings, Marcus Webb stood with his hands covering his face, shaking with 40 years of grief finally released. One of the other crew members, a woman named Sarah who'd worked with Marcus for years, put her hand on his shoulder. She didn't ask questions. Just stood there with him. When Dylan finished the song, he let the final note fade completely before lifting his hands from the strings. The silence held for 3 heartbeats. Then the audience erupted. Not wild applause, but something deeper. Standing ovation built from recognition and respect and the collective understanding that they'd witnessed something beyond performance. Dylan nodded once. Set down his guitar again. And did something he'd never done before in 15 years of touring. He walked to the edge of the stage, gestured toward the wings, and spoke directly to the shadows. Come out here. Marcus froze. Surely Dylan didn't mean him. Surely. You, Dylan said, still not looking directly at anyone but somehow making it clear. Stage crew. Guy who said the name. Come out. Sarah gave Marcus a gentle push. Go, she whispered. Marcus stepped out of the shadows into the stage light. Blinking. Terrified. 63 years old and feeling like a 14-year-old boy standing at his brother's funeral. Dylan waited until Marcus reached center stage. Looked at him properly for the first time. Nodded. What was his name? Dylan asked quietly. The microphone wasn't near them. The audience couldn't hear. This was just between them. William, Marcus said, his voice hoarse. My brother. He died when he was 17. That song, it was his favorite. He was learning to play it when he... Dylan nodded again, understanding everything that wasn't being said. How long? Dylan asked. 40 years. Another nod. Dylan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a guitar pick. Old. Worn. The kind you keep not because it works particularly well but because it means something. This was my brother's, Dylan said, pressing the pick into Marcus's hand. David. He gave it to me before I left Minnesota. Told me to think of him when I played. Marcus looked down at the small piece of plastic in his palm. Felt its weight. Understood the gift for what it was. Play for them, Dylan said simply. The ones we lost. That's what the music is for anyway. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. The audience couldn't hear the conversation. Couldn't see the guitar pick. But they could see the moment. 2 men standing in silence. Some kind of understanding passing between them. And then Dylan's hand on Marcus's shoulder, brief and firm, before Marcus walked back into the wings. Dylan picked up his guitar one more time. Looked out at the audience. Thank you for waiting, he said. And continued the concert. But something had shifted. The performance had a different quality for the rest of the night. More present. More vulnerable. Like a door had been opened that couldn't quite be closed again. After the show, as the crew was breaking down the stage, Dylan came to find Marcus. No entourage. No handlers. Just Dylan, still in his performance clothes, carrying his guitar case. Keep the pick, Dylan said. I meant it. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. And Marcus? Dylan added, turning back. Your brother heard you tonight. I'm sure of it. They never spoke again. Dylan continued his tour. Marcus continued working stages. But Marcus carried that guitar pick in his pocket every day for the rest of his life. Share and subscribe, Some stories deserve to be remembered. Years later, when Marcus died at 78, his family found the pick in his wallet, worn smooth from decades of being touched. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written a single word: William. Dylan never explained what happened that night. Interviewers asked about the pause in the San Francisco show. He'd just smile slightly and say, "Sometimes you stop to listen." The song returned to his set list. Not every night, but sometimes. And when he played it, crew members noticed he'd pause before the first chord. Just for a second. Like he was making room for the ones who weren't there to hear it. That's the thing about Dylan. He didn't heal grief with grand gestures. He did it with silence. With space. With understanding that some things don't need explanation. Just recognition. Just presence. Just one whispered name in the dark.